Hey fearsome friends, the ghosts and ghouls are out tonight. Grab that sage and get rid of those Ouija boards, because it's time to get cozy, comfy, warm, and let your nightmares in. So there was a house in my area that burnt down several years ago, when I was still a child and living in my old house. There are no reported deaths, but I beg to differ. When I was around 12 years old, and whilst the house was still relatively fresh from the fire, me and a friend decided to go inside and explore it. There was an unlocked window which we climbed through, and although my memory is a bit hazy, I do remember the staircase being black and ashen and the walls and ceiling ripping apart. I also remember walking into a room which looked like a child's room, as there was a framed picture of two girls and some family photos. Me and my friend left soon after, and the house got remodeled, and frankly I forgot about it. Fast forward a few years later though, when me and my family moved from our old small house into a new 2-story house in our area that we still live in to this day. And yes, you've guessed it, it's that same house that burnt down. Now things were fine for a few years. I didn't experience anything weird, but that however changed around 2 years ago when I began seeing and hearing things that were mainly in my room and occasionally around the rest of the house as well. It started off with voices, especially when I would be going to sleep. I have no history of mental health issues, so this was a new occurrence for me. I'd be laying on my side, trying to go to sleep, and I would hear a woman's voice singing into my ear. She would sing, whisper unintelligible things, sometimes speak to me, but I could never make out anything she was saying. It was the most surreal thing ever, because it would be as though she was right next to me or above me, but every time I'd turn around to see who was there, there would be nobody. This then escalated to hearing voices of two girls. It wouldn't be in my ear as before, but would rather be around the room. They would sing kid songs, rhymes, etc. I then began hearing constant knocking on my door, and the floor creaking in my room as though someone was walking around. I even called out a few times to see if anyone was there, and I'd ask my sister if she was at my door, but she would always say no. This went on for a while before I actually began to see her. Not the kids, but the woman. I'd see her all the time, in fact, and they'd always be split-second glances, then she would disappear. She would be in the creepiest places and positions too. A lot of the time I'd see her in the corners of the ceiling in my room, right above my bed, on all fours and clutching onto the ceiling. I saw her like this as I walked past my sister's room as well. I'd see her walking down the stairs, head down, hand on the rail, and sometimes she would stand in my room and just look at me. Again, I would only ever see her for a second at the most, but it's so vivid in my memory. The weird thing is, she has never scared me. Sure, the knocking and voices freaked me out at first, but when I began actually seeing her, there was no fear at all. It was quite calming, actually. I tried to talk to her sometimes too, but she'd obviously never respond. Nowadays, I haven't seen her around much. The kids' chants have gone, but I still occasionally hear her whispering or humming into my ear when I'm about to go to sleep. I've moved rooms as well, so maybe that's why. Sometimes I do end up sleeping in my old room, and those are the nights where I hear her the most. My cat, however, still stares at the door, and the ceiling, and at an empty spot in my room. Sometimes she hisses, sometimes she just meows. I've told my mum about my experiences, and my sister, but both haven't seen or heard her specifically. They both believe me though, and think something is wrong with the house. So this is weird as hell for me, and I assure you 100% of what I'm saying and stating are actual events with witnesses. Now, my first memory of my ability was when I was about 6, when I wanted to go to McDonald's, but my parents wanted to go to a beachside restaurant. Apparently I said the words, "I'll make it so they won't let us in." We parked the car up to see people rushing out of the restaurant, and within a few minutes ambulances and fire trucks started rushing there. A fire had broken out, and it was unexplained. However, later they reported that the fire was caused by a short circuit. The next incident was when I was about 10, and I suddenly woke up screaming at my mom to go check on Grandpa. When she did, she could see he was struggling to breathe and had gotten there just in time to hear his final words, which were, "I see divine people." Another incident was when I saw my 25-year-old and 24-year-old cousins, who were sisters, in a dream with my aunt in my house in Dubai, and I distinctly remember my aunt asking if the food she'd made was better than the food my mum makes. The weird thing was, though, that my aunt and cousins lived in Ireland, and I lived in Dubai, and I'd only seen them when I was 6 months old. After about 3 months, they planned to visit us because they had vacation time and hadn't been to a different country in a long while. And while they were with us, my aunt made breakfast for me and repeated the same thing that I'd heard in my dream, and both my cousins were seated just like in the dream as well. The next incident was when I had a premonition of me drowning in a place I've never been to. It was a month back, and I remember swimming in a pool that looked small but was really deep. Well, guess what? I literally drowned a week back in a hotel in Abu Dhabi. It's like a different state in the United Arab Emirates. Also, I've never been in this hotel. I got into the pool thinking there were steps into it, when I lost my balance and I found I was in the deep end, which was 2.5 meters down. As I was struggling in the water, instead of seeing my life flash before my eyes, I started seeing my sister's boss's husband in my head. I told my sister what had happened, and she just laughed it off. But today I noticed that my sister was wearing all black, so I asked her if she was going to a funeral. Then she told me that her boss's husband had just died. Another and final incident I want to share is when my mum told me what happened when I was maybe around 3 years old. I'd apparently seen a flight land whilst we were dropping someone off at the airport, and I said, "Something is wrong with the airplane." Later on, we heard news from the people we'd dropped at the airport that their flight had been rescheduled because one of the engines had caught fire during takeoff. Now, this has all been happening quite a lot, and there are more incidents, but these are the ones I can recall as of now. So I work at a mental health facility, and strange things happen a lot there, like doors closing and opening, or seeing things out of the corner of your eyes. You know, normal creepy hospital stuff. Well, what I'm about to tell you was the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me. One night about a year ago, I was working the night shift on the adolescent unit when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. Immediately afterwards, this girl came running out of her room, screaming, "The devil comes at 333, and was just repeating it over and over again. We got her some meds, and she went back off to sleep. But the next night it happened again. However, this time, I happened to look at the clock, and it said 333. Now, they don't have clocks in their rooms, and they can't have watches, so there would have been no way that she knew what time it was. We played back the camera, and she just went from dead asleep to balls to the wall. And she did this every single night for her entire stay, which was about 5 days. And during that time, the creepy hospital stuff seemed to happen more. Random door buzzers going off, doors opening and closing, lights going on and off, and that creepy being watched, hair-raising on your neck feeling. Every day she would say that she didn't remember getting up, and had no idea what we were talking about. So about a week after she'd been transferred to a long-term facility, I got called to get a report from the ED sending a patient to us. I was reading through the notes, and at the very end it said that parents report patient repeatedly saying that the devil comes at 333. I checked the name to see if it was the same girl, and it wasn't. I called the call-on physician, and he immediately declined the patient. To this day, all the staff have no idea what happened, and everyone who talked to her feels she genuinely had no idea what was going on, including our child's psych doc. He said her expression seemed genuine, and he was certain she didn't recall the events from the nighttime episodes. I sleep with a nightlight ever since that experience. Three years ago, I went to the hospital because I had a strong desire to want to kill myself. I was so stressed, but wasn't afraid of anything in particular, and yet my pulse was so strong, my chest was hurting. The next day I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital for minors, where there were only babies and maybe a 10-year-old boy, but the hallways were empty, and I was alone in a room at the end of the hall. Now I had a blade in my journal for when I wanted to hurt myself. I never did. I just kept it in case I had to cut myself in order to have a room in the hospital. Yes, I was that desperate. So the first 2 days in the hospital, I was given Tercian. Then I had nothing for 3 weeks. They'd written on my file, which remained in my room, that I'd gotten to sleep at around 9 or 10 p.m. But according to the record of my phone calls, I was still awake at midnight. Now 2 days before they discharged me, I'd watched a very disturbing scene on TV that really scared me. I searched for help in vain, but there was no nurse nearby, not a single living soul around. So I laid back down on my bed, when suddenly a black woman came into my room. She was wearing white clothes, but not the ones I had seen the doctors, nurses, or patients wearing. Nothing was written on them, and she told me that she worked for the security of the building. It must have been 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were in my bathroom, soaking the sheets of my diary in trays that she'd brought in to me. I wanted to burn them, but we couldn't do this for obvious reasons. The diary was full of bad emotions, so I turned it into balls of mush, though the lady didn't get her hands wet at all. Being back home in my apartment now, I believe that many people had died here. This would explain the supernatural activity I was experiencing, and it would also explain the feeling of intense danger that I'd feel when going down to my basement. The other day I discovered that in the past, 3 bombs have exploded on this street, one of them exactly where our apartment is built today. My mother then called me to tell me that there was a bad smell coming from the basement. Going down there, I could see what only looked like our lockdown food stocks had exploded. Now there's the tarpaulin on the floor, and it's not wet on the top, but from underneath. The pieces of cardboard and carpets that were installed by the previous owner, which have been dry for 20 years, are now soaked with some kind of liquid, the floor beneath that too. But the craziest thing about all of this is, amongst all this mess is my diary that I'd previously destroyed in a closed bag with my 2011 course notebooks. This all happened yesterday, and we spent the night cleaning the basement. There is no way that I dreamt I destroyed that diary. I didn't even have it when I returned home. But I just don't know how to explain it. In 2002, I was a junior in high school, and as long as I can remember, I always wake up at 3 a.m. This is important for later. Since 8th grade, my best friend and I would ride the bus together. Where we lived was over an hour away, so we would be picked up at 6:30 a.m, and depending on the season, it would still be dark outside. I would leave my house, walk to hers and pick her up, then we would go to the bus stop together. I had this same morning routine for years, with the same alarm set for 5 a.m. and another for 6 to let me know I needed to leave. So one morning my alarm went off at 5 a.m. We also had a clock in the bathroom and another in the dining room, and as I woke up and got ready, all the while I was checking the clocks in the different rooms. My 6 a.m. alarm then went off and I was heading out the door. Now we had a family friend staying that night on the couch. She sat up and said, "You're leaving? What time is it?" And we both looked at the clock in the dining room where it read just after 6 a.m. She said, "Ugh, I need to get up and get ready soon. I have to leave at 6:30. So I headed out and it was still dark, really dark. It had snowed the night before and was enough to cover my shoes. I set out walking to my best friend's house, but whilst on my way, I had a feeling of fear. The street was completely empty, and there weren't many streetlights on, so it wasn't lit well. It was so eerily quiet, when I realised that no lights in any of the houses were on either. I eventually got to my friend's house and knocked on her bedroom door, as her bedroom door was also the back door of the house. However, I noticed that her lights weren't on, and there was no radio blaring as usual, just silence. I looked around and thought, maybe school was cancelled today. Maybe we have it off and I forgot. Confused, I walked all the way to the bus stop, but no one was there. I decided to head home, but now I was in a hurry. I picked up the pace when I noticed something flash under one working streetlight between me and home in the distance. I stopped and suddenly I heard crunching footsteps in the snow approaching fast. I was trembling and trying to decide what to do next, when my sister's face came into view and her eyes were wide with terror. She screamed, "What are you doing?" Now I'm relieved but also confused. "Well, I was going to school but no one is out." "I guess there's no school today," I replied. She grabbed me and started rushing me home, and as I walked into the house, my mum was in tears. Our family friend had a very confused look on her face and was shrugging. I asked, "What's wrong?" My sister said, "It's 3:30 in the morning. Why are you out walking around? Mum heard you leave and thought you were running away." Side note, we lived in a sketchy part of town. So sketchy I was kidnapped later that year, so her fear and anger wasn't unwarranted. Although I was pretty boring, so I would never run away. I was shocked. I told her it was after 6 and our family friend also insisted that when she looked at the clock, it was 6:03 a.m. She and I were looking at each other in disbelief. After my mum and sister calmed down, I explained what had happened. Someone mentioned the bewitching hour, and demons were brought into the discussion, and even electrical issues. If it hadn't been for our family friend, who was an adult, vouching for me and the time, they wouldn't have believed me. I still wake up at 3 a.m, and a few other crazy incidents have happened since. One being, a woman had approached me once and said that there is a dark entity following me and wants to hurt me. She said if I ever acknowledge it, it could really hurt me. Needless to say, I don't acknowledge those moments where your hair stands up. I'll wake up at 3 a.m. and keep busy until I fall asleep again, and I definitely won't mess with a Ouija board. Maybe I'm still scared, or maybe I'm smart. I know better than to say who's there in a horror movie and give away my location. I used to work as a guide, and then as a backup, and even as a field director, for several wilderness therapy programs for troubled kids in Arizona, Utah, and Idaho. They were all good jobs, but where I worked in Utah was in the West Desert, south of Dugway. It's probably the ugliest and creepiest part of Utah, with tons of sketchy stuff happening to us out there. This story happened in 2005. The groups were camped in a really nice area for that part of the desert that is called Indian Canyon. This spot was so nice, in fact, that in the late 1800s or early 1900s, some enterprising pioneer family had built themselves a little homestead with a one-room cabin, a small barn and a cedar pole fence around the perimeter of the little farm. All of that, of course, now was a crumbling, rotten ruin, as the cabin, it seemed, had burned down well over 50 years ago, and what remained of the barn was poking out of the grass in 2 or 3 foot shards of grey wood scattered all over the near vicinity. This week I was also camped in Indian Canyon, but further down the road. I was manning the Infield Emergency Response Vehicle, or ERV, and better known as backup. It was a new position that I'd helped invent when I took a list of things that had gone wrong in the field to the directors. I explained that because of the horrible response time and the spotty satellite phone service, the only reason we weren't shut down or that people weren't dead was because we were lucky, not because we were prepared or efficient at responding to emergencies. Now we had radios and someone listening to them 24/7, never more than a few minutes away with a vehicle. That's how it worked in theory anyway. One of the boys' groups was camped at the mouth of the canyon in the foothills about 2 miles away from me. The other just a mile beyond them, and the girls were close too. I was camped somewhere in the middle of the canyon, on top of a small ridge that had a little jeep track side road branching off of the main dirt road, running up the canyon, and the girls were just a couple of ridges over, maybe a mile away. To drive to them, though, I'd have to go back out to the main road and take a different jeep trail up to their spot, which would mean maybe a 5-mile trip. I was about 1.5 miles below the staff training group that was being headed up by my now ex-wife Jessica. There were going to be several groups of parents coming out to visit their kids later in the week, so both the boys and the girl groups, all on that side of the mountain, had all elected to stay put for a few days and work on building backpacks and gathering fire sets, along with a lot of other primitive skills. The training group had been in the field for almost a week, and they were getting ready to split up and go join the student groups for the last several days of their training. This left me with less to do than normal. I didn't have to find new sites for groups or drop anyone's water or food. Everyone was well taken care of, and no one was moving for several days. I decided to build a sweat lodge next to the creek up near where the new staff were camped. I found the perfect spot, well out of sight of the group, and on a little smooth sandbar right next to the water. I got to work. I harvested some long willow saplings that were bendable enough to weave a frame, and arranged them in a 10-foot circle, digging down 1.5 feet for each one to anchor it into the sand. I bent them into a dome, 4 foot high and 10 foot across, and wove the branches together with supporting crossbars until I had a structure that I probably could have stood on without breaking it. I walked down to the truck, which I had hidden in some pine trees 1/4 mile away, and hauled a large bin of tarps and cowhides and plastic sheeting along with my fire set and some other gear up to my lodge. As I was walking back to the creek, I remember feeling like someone was following me, but when I stopped and looked, I couldn't see or hear anything. It was a beautiful day for July. The morning had started out with some high wispy clouds, but that had long since burned off, and the noon sun was high overhead. It wasn't yet too hot, however. I was high enough in the mountains that the oppressive heat that I knew was slowly baking the kids' groups in the desert below wouldn't reach me for another couple of hours. I set to work placing hides first on my little domed frame. I covered those with some tarps and plastic sheeting and secured it all, so I had close to an airtight and waterproof shelter with only a small arched opening for a door. I secured an old military poncho over the door so that once hot rocks had been placed inside, it could be sealed shut, and the sweat ceremony could take place. I wanted it as hot as possible. There wouldn't be any children involved in this one, so we could go as hot as we wanted. I took the extra time around the base of the lodge to bury all the edges of the coverings deep in the sand. This was the most sturdy shelter structure I had ever built, and it was nice. I spent a good hour gathering sage and juniper, and covered the floor of the lodge with a thick padding of the fragrant plants. I did this in part so that it was a soft place to sit for an extended time, but mostly I did it because I was intending to invite the new staff down to do a sweat ceremony later to help some of them prepare to meet actual students for the first time. And frankly, a group of unwashed men and women who hadn't showered in a week in July, all crammed inside a sweltering homemade dome tent sweating buckets, is a smell that should not be endured without as much sage and juniper as possible. If it was really bad, which it was likely to be, I would rub some of it into my shirt and then pull it up over my nose and breathe through that. I went hunting for lava rock. I found an outcropping of small rounded boulders, perfect for heating on a bonfire, and then rolling it into the lodge, I proceeded to gather 3 onto a tarp. It was heavy, almost too much for me to sling over my back and carry, but I managed to make it back to the fire pit I had dug with all 3. I left them there and went to gather more. I made this a smaller load because it's not like I was in a hurry. I could take more trips. When I got back to the fire pit, one of my rocks was gone. I just stared at the small depression in the sand where I had placed it minutes before, and then looked around for signs that someone, possibly one of the staff from the group, had come and taken it away. There were no tracks. I looked around again and spotted it by the edge of the creek 20 feet away. There were no tracks, but I looked around again and spotted it by the edge of the creek 20 feet away. I had that feeling again, like I was being watched, but I couldn't see anyone in the trees. I walked over and retrieved my stone, and the heaviest one I had carried, and put it back with the others. Maybe it had rolled there, through the flat, soft, dry sand. I gathered a bunch more rocks, and none of them went missing, and then I built a fire. As I worked, that weird feeling of being watched came back, only this time it felt more ominous, like whatever it was mad at me for being there. I stood up, determined to walk out into the woods and find whoever it was. The radio, which I kept on and strapped to my belt, had been silent all day, but it suddenly crackled to life. It was Brian in the boys' group doing evening check-in a little early, so that they could do their day hike without having to stop and contact me. After we talked, I felt more normal again. I cooked some rice and beans for dinner, and as they cooled off, I piled my stones, probably 30 of them, into a cairn in the center of the fire, and then just piled on all the dry wood and brush I could gather. I took my knife out of my sheath, because that feeling was back, and worse this time. As soon as my fire became almost irresponsibly big, I saw someone moving fast through the trees, straight towards me. I tensed up, then relaxed. Will, a seasoned staff member working the training group with Jessica and Katie, came running down the creek. He stopped when he saw me and my sweat lodge and my 10-foot-tall flames, and broke into a huge grin. "I thought it was a wildfire," he said. "Some of the new girls are panicking." "Nope, just an epic sweat lodge," I said. "I was planning on inviting you all down for it when you called in, but I'll consider this your check-in. If you guys want to, you're all invited to come sweat. It'll be ready in about half an hour." "Perfect," he said. "They're just finishing up dinner. I'll go let Katie and Jess know and we'll be down." He turned to walk away. "Hey Will," he turned back around. "Did you guys lose track of any of the new guys today? Or did one of you 3 come down this way?" He thought for a moment and said, "No, I don't think so. Why?" "It's nothing," I said. "I just thought someone might have come looking for me when I was out gathering rocks. Some of my stuff was in a different place than I remember leaving it, is all." He looked at me with an odd expression. "Weird," he said finally. "I'll ask everyone, but we've kept pretty busy today, so I don't know when someone would have come down this far." "It's okay," I said. "Don't stress it, I was just wondering. See you in a few minutes." The other 2 kids group radioed me shortly after Will walked off. It was more like an hour before the staff group finally trudged into my little sandy clearing. And some of them looked confused at my dome of plastic and sand, my pile of glowing red boulders that was still blazing with fire, and at the stack of the blue 5-gallon water jugs I'd hauled down from the truck for the experience. "We thought we were going to die in a forest fire," one of the new girls, Carol Sue, said accusingly. She looked extra smelly. I pulled some essential oils out of my possibles bag. A possibles bag is just a type of leather purse we make on the trail that we call possible bags to disguise the fact that we are in fact grown men who carry around purses. "Put some of this on your wrists and neck. It'll help you keep a good frame of mind in the sweat." "How many of you have done this before?" A handful of them raised their hands. Inside the circle of the lodge is a sacred place. We will do 4 sessions, going longer and longer each time. We will dedicate each session to a different part of our lives. Our histories, our families, our struggles, and our choices. Try to only speak from the heart about these things. It will be very hot once we begin pouring water on the rocks, and the heat will make it very difficult to speak anyway, so only speak if it is important. Katie and Will were already rolling the superheated rocks into the lodge using some long willow poles I had made. I gave Jess a side hug. The trainees didn't know we were married, and we'd found it best not to let kids or people new to the wilderness know, because it could become a distraction from the experience if they got too caught up in our personal lives. So a side hug was all we would do. As far as they knew, we were just co-workers. I took out a dried sage smudge and lit it on the fire, and did the ritual smoke cleansing for each of them as they entered the hallowed ground. I made the last-minute decision not to go into the sweat lodge. That last boys' group had a student that was a little bit of trouble, and I was worried I would end up having to take an emergency radio call about a runner in the middle of someone's heartfelt speaking about their issues with their family or their past. And the smell. Also, something just felt off. This was a perfect spot and a perfect time for a sweat lodge ceremony, but it felt not wrong exactly, but off somehow. Instead, I whispered my choice and that maybe I'd join the next session to Katie, as she was the last to enter, and I sealed the door up behind them, burying the edge of the poncho in the sand like the rest of the construction. I stood by the fire for a minute or 2 and felt hot, so I walked into the water down the narrow stream about 100 yards and just looked at the stars that were slowly becoming more and more visible in the darkening twilight. I stood there for at least 10 minutes, enjoying the changing sky, when suddenly I heard a twig snap somewhere to my left, and the crickets went silent. There was definitely somebody away up there in the trees. I stared hard and could not at first see anyone, but there was a small dark shadow under a pine 30 or 40 feet away. It was too dark for this early in the evening. Was that a girl in the shadow? It looked like a small Native American girl with 2 long braids and some kind of headband. I called out to her, but she didn't move. She seemed to be glaring at me, and the longer I stood there, the worse I felt, like the warmth from the air around me was being sucked away. I took a deep breath and did what I always do in the woods when something unknown scares me. I ran at it. Whoever was there took off fast, and I chased them. I lost them quickly enough though, as I'm not a runner, but I was sure they had been headed in the direction away from my little creekside sweat lodge. I must have gone 1/8 of a mile, almost to the road, when I heard all of the staff at the sweat lodge scream behind me. My blood ran cold, and I turned on my heel and sprinted back up the canyon. I almost missed the sweat lodge clearing when I came to it, because nothing I saw made sense. The fire was out, not even aglow, and the sweat lodge was gone. The tarps had all been pulled and ripped off, and they and the hides were flung out in a wild circle on the ground, in the bushes and in the water. The frame was uprooted and folded over onto its side, to one side of the sandbar, and all the new experienced staff were sitting stunned in a circle on a padding of sage and juniper around a pile of cold rocks. "What happened?" I yelled as I ran up. After a moment, Katie answered. "We were just sitting here, starting to pour water on the rocks to heat things up. And when we started talking a little about what it meant to know your personal history, the walls of the sweat lodge started shaking, and we thought you were outside trying to get in. It stopped for a minute and Jess called your name, but you didn't answer, and we just poured some more water onto the rocks when the whole lodge went cold, like really cold, and it sounded like a massive windstorm blew in and ripped the whole thing off of us. I didn't know what to do, so I grabbed my bag and got out every flashlight I had. We started them checking each other for injuries. I lied to them through my teeth and told them it was a microburst windstorm and that they happened sometimes in Utah, and that they were lucky no one got hurt, and so on. And amid skeptical looks from the three who knew me, I got Jessica and Will to start taking the stunned newbies back to camp. But Katie stayed. Katie, who had been with me through so many other explainable things out there, knew what I was doing. She could tell I wasn't saying something. "The fire is out, like it's cold, and it was 1,000 degrees 20 minutes ago. And the rocks that were glowing hot 20 minutes ago feel like they've been sitting in the creek," she said. "What are you not saying, Dan?" I took a deep breath. I just tried to chase down a little Native American girl who can run unnaturally fast in the dark. Katie sat down hard. I looked at her, but she didn't say anything, so I continued. "Today, while I was gathering rocks for the lodge, I felt like someone was watching me the whole time, and I swear I'm not making this up. But I set down that really big rock, the first one you rolled into the circle, and I walked away for a few minutes. But when I returned, it was over by the creek, like someone had come and moved it. But there were no tracks, and it couldn't have rolled there. Then after you all went into the sweat lodge, I walked down the creek and heard something in the trees. It took me a minute to spot her, but she was hiding in a shadow under a tree. I think I had chased her for about 30 seconds, when you all started screaming, and I ran back up here." What Katie said to me next made me sit down too. "Did she have 2 braids and a headband?" I nodded slowly. "Early this morning, like 3 in the morning early, Jessica woke up everybody and said it was going to rain and that we needed to build a shelter." "But there were no clouds last night," I said. "I know," said Katie, "but she woke us all up and insisted that we needed to build a shelter and wouldn't drop it until we moved closer together and put up some tarps. I like to see the stars if I wake up, so I moved in close just in case, but I didn't get under a tarp. Neither did Will or Josh. He's one of the new guys. Well, this morning, just before it got light, I had a really disturbing dream where I felt like I was awake in my sleeping bag and was staring up into the tree above me. And there was this little Native American girl with 2 braids and a blue-grey headband up in the tree, in my face and staring at me. I knew I was dreaming, but I couldn't move or wake up. I was only able to move when Josh on the other side of the shelter yelled and sat up. I thought it was just a horrible dream until I talked to Jess about the rain last night. She admitted to me that she hadn't been worried about rain, but that she had been dead asleep when she felt someone reach into her sleeping bag and shove her head to the side. She panicked and laid there and pretended like she was still sleeping, but they knelt over her face for a few minutes. She said she was terrified to open her eyes. When she felt them leave, she waited for a few minutes and then woke everyone up. I was wondering why she slept in the middle of everyone. Now it makes sense. I was quiet. Katie spoke again. Before breakfast, I asked Josh why he yelled and sat up. I was grateful he did, but curious as to why. He told me that he had a horrible nightmare about a little Native American girl, and when he thought he woke up, he saw her running at him. He yelled and she jumped over his head and took off. And that's when he really woke up and sat up. He was surprised I heard him yell, and he thought he was still asleep at that point, and thought he'd dreamt the yelling part. I didn't tell Jess or Josh what happened to me, and I didn't tell them about each other. But at breakfast, Will told all of us about his horrible dream about a little girl dying in that cabin when it burned down. We all freaked out. It's all we've been talking about today. Half of the group didn't believe us, and Carol Sue, the loud annoying one, has told everyone that we're just trying to haze the new guys. Even Josh, who was a new guy, is in on it apparently. And then the sweat lodge thing happened. With what you just told me, I don't think any of us were dreaming. We were quiet for a long time. I think we should move camp down the road tomorrow, I finally said. I'll clean up this mess in the morning. Katie just nodded and stood up. Oh, and Katie, it's probably a good idea for everyone to be under the shelter to sleep tonight. And also, maybe don't light another fire. I'm guessing the one at your group site is out too. She sighed tiredly and walked off into the dark. I just sat there for a while and then slowly made my way back to the truck. I didn't feel like anyone was watching me anymore, but that didn't stop me from sleeping in the cab with the doors locked for the rest of the week. I'm really not sure why, but I was hoping to run something by you all that I experienced a while back. This was quite some time ago, but I still occasionally think about it. I need to preface this with some information about my friend. Let's call her Jane. I know Jane through a friend, and we were quite close. I would visit her often to have dinner, and we would talk for hours. She travelled a lot for work, and usually her daughter would house sit. However, Jane moved to a new place that year, and very soon after her moving there, she began to show a lot of paranoia about her landlord, who lived in the other unit of the duplex. She would tell me how she was certain that he was entering her place when she was away, without asking or telling her. Once I came over and she had me take all her duct covers and fixtures off to check for cameras. Due to all this new paranoia, she wasn't comfortable with her daughter sitting for her, and asked if I would do it instead. I happily accepted. The first few nights were fine, but I definitely didn't feel comfortable in the house. It felt as if I was trespassing, and something was kind of judging or watching me. The feeling seemed to grow stronger the closer I got to the storage room in the back of the master bedroom. I brushed it off as just me being uncomfortable in the new space, and the vibe she had with her landlord. But things peaked a few days before I left. I had stayed up late that night watching TV, since I had never really had cable TV and was kind of enjoying the mindless channel surfing. Jane had all the channels and it was awesome. After realizing it was late and that I had to work the next morning, I switched the TV off and went to bed. As I was settling in, trying to get comfortable in the bed, I began to feel agitated. Pretty quickly I had this rush of emotion that hit me out of nowhere. I am usually stoic to a fault, and so this part really confuses me. Basically, I just had this insane rush of negative emotions. I started to spiral into thinking about how I was a failure and an imposter, and how all my friends viewed me with disdain and considered our friendship a burden. It was just all sorts of negative talk and self-worth stuff. Unsettled by this rush of emotions, I opened my eyes and immediately felt like something was watching me from the far corner of the room by the door to the storage room. I looked over and saw what I can only describe as a sort of thick darkness. No real shape or anything, no silhouettes or figures, but it just felt like the darkness in the room was deeper and thicker and kind of congealing in that corner. Between that and the sudden rush of emotions, I kind of freaked, and my brain jumped to a conversation my friend Mike had had with me about his history with energy vampires at his old business. I wrote it off at the time as a crazy conversation and nothing else, but in that moment it was all I really had. Mike had told me that he had always had issues with negative forces and beings, and that he had to learn how to ward them off. The process, he said, was simple. You have to assert yourself vocally and banish them while repeating positive affirmations and visualizations. So not really having any other way to turn, and kind of freaking out, I immediately started saying a bunch of stuff out loud. Things like, "You're not welcome here. I cannot be harmed by you. Leave and never come back." I just focused through the swirling vortex of negative emotions and repeated these phrases with increasing volume and confidence. Pretty quickly, the heavy feeling in the room started to lift, until everything just sort of popped and things got really still. I took a deep breath, got up, blocked the door to the storage room with a desk, and turned in for the night. Sleep came fairly quickly after that, as I felt pretty drained at that point. I woke up the next morning and everything was fine. I was exhausted, but nothing seemed disturbed, and I felt kind of foolish. I dismissed it as a sudden unprompted panic attack or something, and just moved on. Not sure if it matters or not, but her cat, who was adopted from a feral cat rescue program, and not very friendly, slept with me that night. It was the one and only time that cat has ever gotten close to me for more than 5 minutes. 2 days later, Jane came back from her trip. I packed up and went home and never said a word to her about it. A few months later, Jane moved out of that place. She had become absolutely convinced that the storage room connected to the other duplex somehow, and that her landlord was using it to come into her apartment without her consent. She never mentioned anything to me about any weirdness, though. I don't really know why I'm sharing this now. Maybe it's just because I've been in a period of retrospect lately, so I'm unpacking old oddities in my brain. Just thought I'd post it here, as sort of a talking into the void exercise, and to see if anyone had any thoughts. First, let me give you a bit of backstory. I grew up experiencing a multitude of paranormal phenomenon, from doors slamming in the middle of the night, sounds of footsteps running down the hallway or up the stairs, or objects falling off tables or counters for no apparent reason. But despite all of this, it's been quite a long while, years even, since anything strange has happened, and I'm totally okay with that. Recently, a couple of odd things have happened that I'm not sure how to explain. The first instance was maybe over a month ago, a week or two after the Texas winter storm, and our kids were already asleep. My daughter has a kid's Kindle Fire that we let her use to learn her alphabet, colours and numbers, and it also has some kids' videos, including the dreaded Baby Shark ones. The tablet is fairly new, and I had locked it before putting the kids to sleep. My husband was actually out recording something with his band, so it was just me with the kids, and I was in my bedroom using the PlayStation. It had already been a couple of hours since the kids had gone to sleep, so it was probably a little after midnight, when I started to hear music coming from the kids' bedroom. My first thought was, crap, my daughter woke up and went straight for a toy. So I got up and walked over to their bedroom. I looked over to their beds and realised that they were still fast asleep. So I looked around to find the source of the music, and I grabbed the tablet. But it was still locked, and music was playing from it. I unlocked it, and the first thing I saw on the screen was no connection, which made me wonder why the heck it was playing music in the first place. I stopped the music and just turned it off completely. The tablet has never done this before, or after when locked, but maybe it was just a glitch. Fingers crossed. The second instance, I was with my husband in the living room downstairs. We had just finished watching an episode of The Mandalorian, and we were both on our phone, wasting time like one does. The kids were already in bed, so the place was fairly quiet. When suddenly, for no reason at all, there was a loud pop. To me it sounded like someone had clapped really loud right in front of me, as if to get my attention, and my husband said it sounded like a bike tire popping. He checked our son's bike, but the tires were fine. He even looked in the fireplace, assuming maybe something had fallen in, but again found nothing. We looked all over and could not explain what could have made the noise. The pop was so loud my ears ached from the ringing. This happened last week. During the frozen hell week that we had in Texas back in February, we found out that Friday morning that one of our neighbors across from us had died. There were fire trucks and police vehicles all over the parking lot. He had a lot of health complications that were exacerbated by the freezing temperatures and lack of water. I'm really hoping it's not the case, but has anyone else ever experienced strange stuff like this happening after the passing of someone who lived nearby? I was 16 when I went to Italy with my mum, and we had travelled from Australia to go visit my grandmother, who was quite old. We stayed at her house near Pisa in Tuscany. The last time I had been there was when I was 4 years old, and I barely remembered anything. The last time, my grandfather was alive, but he'd died after we'd left, and the story I was always told was that he'd died of a heart attack. He died when I was 5. The heart attack story was all I ever knew, and I never had any reason to question it. So it was the middle of a hot Italian summer when I went to Italy this second time with my mum. One day just before lunch, I decided to explore the family garden. To the side of the garden there was an old shed, and I decided to go inside. Minutes later, whilst I was looking at nothing in particular, the coldest blast of air encircled me. I remember physically holding myself because of the cold, which I thought strange given how warm it was outside. But then it hit me. A thought and feeling that I had really pissed someone off, that someone was behind me, and they did not want me to be there. For a moment I was frozen, when all of a sudden I decided to turn around in an attempt to see what had caused this. As I spun around, my eyes quickly fixated on a hook that was hanging from a beam across the roof of the shed. I remember looking, fixated on that hook, and then the thought came to me to say, I'm really sorry, I'll go. I couldn't get out of there quick enough. Walking back to my grandmother's house, I was shaking. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before. The feeling before I turned to look at the hook was dark, sad, heavy and overpowering. It was filled with pain, and I never said anything to anyone for years. Fast forward 6 years when I was back in Australia with my mum, and we were reminiscing about that trip to Italy. I remember saying something like, "It was great to see Grandma again before she died. What a shame Grandad had already gone." And when I said that, my mum stopped and looked at me and said, "I need to tell you something." And that was all she said, and all of a sudden I felt this internal rush inside me where I was drawn back to that summer's day in Italy 6 years before. The feeling of darkness and pain that I hadn't thought about for years washed over me again, and I looked at my mum and said, "Grandad hung himself in the shed, didn't he?" It was my mum who then froze, then looked at me and said, "Who told you?" "No one," I said, and proceeded to tell her what happened to me all those years ago. This story was told to me by my husband the other day, and it was told to him by a now middle-aged security guard that he knew, and will be written from his perspective. I was a young man back then, and had been working on the job for a few years. I was a security guard, working the security detail in a large shopping mall. And back then, shopping malls were a new phenomena in the country, and people had no idea how to guard them properly. There weren't exactly a lot of us on the security detail, but I was joined by a very young, inexperienced man, this being, I think, the first time he'd been on a job like this, and another older gentleman who had been working security all across Lahore. I'd only been on this job for about a fortnight, and on this particular night we were all just sitting around, stationed at our posts. I had expected another slow night at the mall, as things didn't really happen in our part of the city. However, it must have been around midnight when I started hearing the clanking of chains coming from the basement area. The sound was so loud that it startled me, and I sat up in my seat immediately attentive. I might have been mistaken, but as the clanking continued, I realized that it was definitely coming from the basement. Confused, I paced around for a bit, until the younger guard suddenly came running towards me. He asked me about the sound, to which I told him, and I had no idea what it was. After a bit of discussion, we decided to go check it out, so we grabbed a torch, informed the older gentleman, and started descending into the basement below. Now the mall had shops down there too, but the sound was coming from the storage area, which made it even more unusual. No one had access to the basement except a handful of employees, including the three of us, and there was only a single elevator and a set of stairs that could take you to that floor. The young guard and I opted for the stairs, mainly because we wanted to surprise or potentially scare whoever was making the sounds. But by the time we descended to the ground floor, our torch had turned off. This alarmed the two of us, as we were already creeped out, and the young man had already started to sweat. I told him not to worry and reminded him that we had guns if something was to go south, and I opened a small single door that opened into the basement. Now, as you would expect, it was pitch black. All we could hear was the clanking, now louder and right in front of us. I acted as if my life was depending on whatever was happening right now, and that we could have gotten attacked at any moment. My heart started to race, and I banged the flashlight on my leg, thankfully making it spring to life. Getting down there was an empty chair placed right in front of us, a few meters from the door. The clanking continued, and shaking, I pointed the flashlight around and came across the most bizarre scene unfolding. Metal chains. Where they had come from I had no idea. We had no chains in storage. Were being moved from one end of the basement to the other. I could see them gleam in the torch's light. I was stunned. No one was carrying them. The young guard I had brought with me was already screaming. I pointed the flashlight around until it landed on the chair, only now there was a middle-aged man sitting in it, looking at us. He had a terrifying expression on his face and was clearly angry. An odd gust of wind blew by me, and the torch fell to the floor. The young man screamed again and became unconscious. All the while the chains continued moving. I was so frightened that I ran, leaving the young man on the floor of the basement with God knows what. I ran up to where the old man was sitting and told him what had happened. He listened to my story intently and agreed to go down and check it out for himself. He asked if I would come with him, but I refused. The old man reassured me and went into the building, and all I could do was wait for him. And let me tell you, I waited. So this happened to me yesterday. A couple of friends and I decided to go out and eat dinner together to celebrate the end of the first term. During dinner, my buddy wanted to use the bathroom and asked if I could come with them in case anything happened. I said sure, and we went outside of the restaurant to the bathroom. I waited outside while he went in to do his business, and while I was standing there waiting, for what seemed like a while, I decided to go inside the bathroom and see what the holdup was. However, when I went in, the bathroom was completely empty. There was nobody in sight. I went and checked all the stalls and urinals. There is 1 stall and 3 urinals in that bathroom, and there was nobody to be seen. I thought that maybe he had somehow gone out without letting me know, so I decided to call him and ask him why he did that, but he didn't pick up. I began walking back to the restaurant when I looked back and saw him exiting the bathroom. I was so confused and asked him how he'd pulled it off. He was really confused about what I was talking about and said I must have been tripping. We proceeded to have a long discussion, and he insisted he was peeing in the urinal and that I must have gone into the women's bathroom. I denied this and said I definitely went past urinals and went into the men's bathroom. We went back to the restaurant, and my buddy told everyone I must have been doing drugs because of what had just happened. There was no way he or I could have been in the women's bathroom, as I could hear women chatting in there, and if either of them had gone in, we would have been seen and kicked out. There are no hiding spots in the bathroom, so I literally have no clue what happened. I don't do drugs at all, nor do I drink or have any mental illnesses. I seriously have no idea what happened. I lived with my parents for a few years in a rundown town in the outbacks of South Africa. The town is called Uniondale and is kind of infamous regarding its history with ghosts and the paranormal. It's almost on par with Vol.13, which also holds some ghostly significance. Now to the encounter. I was at home, not really doing anything, and my mother was in the kitchen doing whatever, and my father was in the garden planting some vegetables. I decided to go to my room for some fun, maybe play with my toys, but when I was there, something felt a bit off. I didn't know what, and to this day I still don't really know, but all I can say is that it's the feeling you get when you know something is going to happen. A premonition, but much more eerie. I walked over to my closet to get some toys, but when I turned around, I saw something pretty terrifying. There was a man hanging from the rafters, wearing old greyed-out clothes, as if he were in a Betty Boop cartoon. I can't remember if he was hanging by a noose or just hanging on with his hands, but he spoke to me and said, "Get out of my room." I ran out to get my mother and told her about the man in my room, so she rushed in with a knife. I didn't follow her in, but I heard her tell the man to leave. I don't remember what happened after that, but a few months later, we encountered something else. So fast forward maybe 3 months, and my grandma had come to visit. My mum and I were in the kitchen baking something, when suddenly my grandma started yelling. She came rushing into the kitchen, looking absolutely terrified, and told us that she had been ironing clothes, when the hair on her arms stood up, and she saw somebody walk past the bathroom door. She described them as wearing old grey clothes, fitting the exact description of the man that I'd seen in my room before. Then not even a week later, my mum and I were in the kitchen again, when a potato rolled into the kitchen from the hallway. Just a single solitary potato. There was nobody in the hallway when we looked, and we didn't even have any potatoes in the house at the time. Looking back at it, I'm wondering if I fabricated these memories, or if I'm just trying to deny the existence of something paranormal. So something just happened to me, and I know it's not sleep paralysis, because I was fully awake and wasn't feeling sleepy. But yeah, I'll set the scene for you. 2 weeks ago, me and my family moved into this house. The owner's husband recently committed suicide and wanted to rent it out, but she didn't tell us in which room he did it. So everything was normal as I got into bed. I wasn't sleepy at all, because I'd slept that afternoon like I always do. But this second week that I'd been there, I've been hearing noises. The thing is though, today was not going to be the same. I can still hear them, and I try to ignore them, convincing myself that it's normal, but deep down I really don't think it is. I got to bed and tried to sleep, but it wasn't happening, so I was just lying there trying to relax, when I got this feeling of discomfort. I don't know why, I was just not comfortable. Now, I always sleep on my left side to have a view of the room, because I've had stuff happen before. But this time I tried facing the other way around in an attempt to get more comfortable. A couple of minutes passed, and I'd left the phone next to me and prepared to sleep again. But I wasn't asleep, nor was going to sleep anytime soon. Then all of a sudden my room started shaking and vibrating. Then I felt something big and evil. I couldn't see it as I was facing the other way, but I definitely felt it and had a feeling it wasn't there just to say hello. The aura in the room was pure evil, and I could feel it had insidious intentions. That thing wanted to kill me. The room was shaking harder and harder, and I could feel that thing getting closer and closer to me the harder the room shook, and it felt like gravity was pushing me down. I couldn't breathe, but I could move a little. I could move my hands, but I was being pushed down. I tried to be brave, and with all my strength I pushed myself up. I was able to get up a little, and as soon as I felt whatever it was vanish. Barely breathing and struggling to talk, I called my parents and went to their room to sleep instead. I locked the door, but I can still hear sounds coming from downstairs. I can hear the door of my room that's in the basement banging, creaks in the floor and little knocks in the walls, and I don't know what's going on, but I can tell that whatever it was is still looking for me, and I don't know what it would do if it got me, and I really don't want to know either. When I was 16, my family moved into a new house, and it was the first time all of us kids would get our own rooms. My parents said I could pick my own room first because I was the eldest, but I decided to just take whatever room was left. I was never at home, except to sleep between work, school and football, so I didn't care how big my room was. The day we moved in, I kind of just set my stuff in a corner of the living room, while everybody else chose their rooms and helped my parents unload all of our stuff. So you can probably imagine my surprise when I found out that the only room that hadn't been picked was the biggest besides the master bedroom. To be honest, I didn't know what to do with all of the space. We'd just come from a house where there was barely enough room to walk because of all of my siblings' beds that were crammed next to mine, and now I had a room all to myself that was even bigger than the one I had to share. Once I had all of my stuff set up and organized, I went to find my dog so we could watch a movie in my room. We had been watching movies together ever since we got her 6 years before, so this was a pretty regular occurrence. I found her chilling in the living room after a day of running around in the backyard, and called her to follow me after picking a movie out of our collection. She hadn't ever been able to run off a leash because we lived in a townhouse before without a backyard, so she was having a blast. She followed me until we hit my brother's room and wouldn't go any further. My room was at the end of the hallway and was part of the original house. Everything except for my room and the dining room was an add-on, so there was a fair bit of distance between my room and all of the others. I figured that it was because she hadn't explored everything yet and just needed time to adjust to the new place, so I just shrugged it off and watched my movie alone. Later that night, I was in the dead of sleep when I randomly woke up and found myself staring into the darkness and wondering what had woken me up. I hit the button on my alarm clock, and once my eyes adjusted to its blinding blue glow, I saw that it was little after 1:30 a.m. When my arm left the comfort of my blanket to activate the light on my clock, I became immediately aware of how cold it was in the room. October in Arizona is nothing like anywhere else in the US. You can still comfortably wander around outside in a tank top and shorts if you want, because it normally only gets down to around 80 degrees Fahrenheit at night, but it had to have been in the high 50s or low 60s in there. I realize that this isn't by any means cold, but when it's consistently as hot as it is in Arizona, that was like waking up in a freezer by comparison. Over the next couple of weeks, this continued to happen despite the fact that the thermostat was set to 75 degrees every night, and other things started happening as well. I was always uneasy being in that room alone, so I eventually convinced my dog to sleep at the foot of my bed one night to make me feel a bit better. She stayed in there the whole night, but she seemed pretty stressed, and when I got up to let her outside in the morning, she refused to go to that side of the house at all. At this point as well, I was starting to have stuff go missing, like homework assignments and pencils that would show up where I left them a couple of days later, and it felt like when someone is looking over your shoulder and you can just feel their gaze. It even got to the point where I couldn't have the closet door slid open, because it just made the whole room feel off when it was. After about a month of this, I just started crashing on the couch in the living room and avoiding going into my room unless I absolutely needed to. After I had been sleeping on the couch for about a week, my brother decided he wanted to switch rooms since I wasn't really using it anyway, and he had a lot more stuff than me. And even though I tried to tell him it was a bad idea, we switched rooms regardless. I didn't have anything weird happen in my new room, and he said he hadn't noticed anything in his, so I figured that I'd been on edge for nothing. Until a couple of days later, one night I heard banging coming from my old room, and figured my brother was just moving things around. He was a night owl, so this wasn't altogether uncommon. The next morning he looked absolutely drained, and I asked what he'd expected if he was going to be up all night banging about. He gave me a sideways glance and asked me what I was talking about. When I said that I could hear him moving stuff around all night, the colour drained from his face a little bit. I asked him what was up, but he denied anything, and we just went on with our day. I started noticing that he was more moody than usual, and seemed to be sleeping a lot more during the day. My mum started picking up on it as well, and we kept on asking him what was up, until he finally told us one day. He was having the same experiences I had been having when he moved into my old room, but he didn't care because it interested him. My family is really religious, except for him. He decided that he didn't want anything to do with religion at a pretty young age, and we all just let him do his thing, because we didn't want it to come between us. He told us that he had been looking into black magic and stuff like that. I don't really understand it, so I won't pretend I know what I'm talking about. But he said that he was messing around with spells and stuff for kicks, and one night he woke up to a shadow figure peeking out at him from inside the closet. And when he got up to tell me off for trying to scare him, it rushed at him and disappeared into thin air. It turned out the banging around I heard that one night was him trying to figure out what could have made him see the figure. Because as I said before, he didn't believe that kind of stuff existed. It got worse over time, with things like that being a regular occurrence, and eventually the rest of us having to deal with weird stuff going on that I won't write down, because this is already long enough. But maybe some other time. He still plays around with tarot cards, and has even talked about trying to get hold of a Ouija board on occasion, so I'm not exactly sure what to do about it. But he'll be off to university soon enough, and I'm going off to the army this summer to pay for the schooling I've been doing. So I guess he will have to try and figure things out for himself. My parents were nice enough to let me stay at home while I was going to university, but it is still really expensive, even with my full-time job. If anyone has suggestions on how I can help him out, I'd be happy to hear them. I mean, he is my brother, so I don't want him to mess with stuff either, that neither of us understands, and get into some trouble that I can't get him out of. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.